I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 1801, which is the counterculture of the 1960s, which kind of overlaps the Vietnam War era, but also kind of looks more broadly at the changing cultural dynamics in the country during the 1960s and 70s. So some of the objectives we'll be looking at here as we move into 1801 will be the rise of the counterculture, some of the major characteristics of the counterculture, and we'll evaluate the positive and negative impacts of what the counterculture had on American society. You can see the imagery towards the top there, one of the major, concerts in the 1960s that you can see some of the counterculture artwork there. So looking at number one, why did the counterculture movement come together during the 1960s? We had a huge or really large baby boom generation that rejected a lot of the social and cultural norms of the time. They put an emphasis on personal experiences, love, peace, freedom. How did the counterculture express themselves? In the way they dressed, bell-bottom pants, long hair, beards, music, communes coming together, illegal usage of drugs, alcoholism, things like that. Three, explain the generation gap of the 1960s. Well, members of the younger generation had developed a common sense of values that contradicted the norms of the 1950s and 60s. These values were created in opposition to their parental styles and tastes. So we remember the 1950s stereotypical family. Well, this baby boom generation of teenagers, really, and people in their early 20s, really were rejecting all those things that we had seen. Four, compare and contrast the environments the baby boomers and their parents grew up with, including information about major events and how these events impacted the generation. Well, the parents of the baby boomers had lived through the Depression and World War II. They valued and respected authority and social conformity. Baby boomers grew up in a time of prosperity, and they believed in political activism, political and personal freedoms, and individuality, having kind of an individual thoughts and ideas. You do not have to kind of be a rubber stamp or a carbon copy of everybody else. Five, explain the impact World War II had on the social fabric of the United States. After World War II, the baby boom that led to a huge population of young people. So the dynamics of the country is shifting. Because of the baby boom generation, we have a large kind of like series of bubble classes of people living in the 1950s and 60s. The sheer size of the young population brought about cultural change. Companies too raced to create music and clothing and other things to appeal to the consumer market of the baby boomers. This created the consumerism and the advent of commercials to kind of target this baby boom generation. Six, how did the counterculture distinguish itself through music, politics, education, media, and personal style? Well, rock and roll music, opposition to the Vietnam War, the protest movement, distrust in authority, which, based on some of the information we found out later on about how the government was lying to us, some of this distrust was warranted. Long hair, unconventional clothing, drug use, tie-dye clothing was really popular. Seven, what do the music and art of the 1960s have in common? Bob Dylan's lyrics and Andy Warhol's paintings challenged mainstream values of consumerism and conformity. During this period of time, communes became very, very popular, became symbolic of the hippie culture. Communes are small communities in which people with common interests share resources to survive. Many of these people didn't have traditional jobs, nor did they wish to have a traditional jobs. Hippies had a very casual attitude towards life. They enjoyed each day to the fullest and did not worry much about the day to come. Here you can see a couple photographs of the hippie groups, the commune on the right there, people living together in a shared community, sometimes out like on a big farm. They had the buses that they kind of painted in tie-dye fashion and kind of be symbolic of their lifestyle and the hippie culture. What criticism do you think the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco drew? Make connections to the way people criticize people with alternate lifestyles today. Many hippies in the Haight-Ashbury area abused drugs, which led to kind of a negative health consequences, increased crime, loitering in the streets, things like that. Today, they're obviously still concerned about the widespread use of drugs as well. 10, why do the ideas of Buddhism and other Eastern religions, as well as the values of Native Americans, appeal to many of the members of hippie culture? Well, they were trying to move away from traditional religion. They were looking for like spirituality outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition they had grown up with, which is kind of a rejection of what the parents had instilled in them as well. Two famous musicians who lost their lives at a very young age during this period of time were Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin through drug overdoses. How did the incident at the Rolling Stones concert impact the hippie culture? Well, the counterculture had valued peace and love for all people, but the violent incident that broke out at the Rolling Stones concert, in which members of the Hells Angels murdered members of the audience, kind of contradicted those ideals. Very traumatic event during this period of time. 13, what events contributed to the end of the counterculture movement of the 1960s? After the murder at the music festival at Altamont and the early deaths of several rock musicians, people began to see the negative side of the counterculture. So for a long period of time, a lot of people might have disagreed with the counterculture, maybe did not agree with their views, but when we're seeing more violence and death break out, also the drug overdoses during this period of time, that basically ripped the lives of young people across the country, more and more people began to turn on the counterculture movement. Lesson reflection question, what is the legacy of the counterculture movement in the 1960s? Obviously music, the clothing of the 1960s, and the right to come together for causes. Probably the most positive impact of the counterculture is the ongoing belief that we see here in society today, the right of people to gather and actually request enforced change within society, not to kind of be laid back and kind of just accepting of things that you starkly disagree with. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion on the counterculture movement. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.